Pay close attention. The news you're about to see is fulfilling Bible prophecy.
Welcome to another edition of YPN News, bringing you the news that relates to Bible prophecy and foretold by Yeshua Hawkins. Our news tonight looks at a first ever, the King of Saudi Arabia visits Russia. We'll have that story, and a controversial judge runs for U.S. Senate, and could the president really end the Iran nuclear deal? But first, more and more there is talk of countries trying to distance themselves from the U.S. dollar, seeking the freedom to trade in their own currency. China is one such nation making big strides in becoming financially independent. Just what have they been doing, and how will it affect the U.S. as well as other economies?
Well, recently on RT's Crosstalk, Peter Lavelle interviewed several people who have been watching these economic developments closely. Ann Lee from New York University, Liam Halligan of Business New Europe, and Alistair McLeod from Gold Money. That's the online service that trades in gold.
Deutsche Bank recently said it's the dawning of the age of Chinese capital, and the implications of that is raising the prospect of fundamental changes in the way the world of finance is wired. While Ms. Lee says this may be a bit exaggerated in its wording, Deutsche Bank is, quote, touching on a longer-term trend.
She says the Chinese are basically trying to push a banking and monetary system that is much more like what Alexander Hamilton was trying to advocate for the United States' first central bank, and that this would be a situation where bank financing and credit would be used to improve nations.
Lee explained the U.S. financial system is currently dominated by speculation involving trading in the stock market and other commodities as well. But in China, the government is working on building a monetary system that focuses on infrastructure in its own country as well as others. They've created initiatives such as the Asian Infrastructure Bank and the Asian Development Bank in cooperation with other nations. So what that means, Katan, is that China's currency will be used more and more in different countries.
Well, China has already come a long way with this, Lee shared. 5 years ago, China's currency wasn't used anywhere in the world, she said, and now they settle 22% of their trade in their currency. So this is happening at a rather rapid trajectory.
So what about the Chinese redback funding the American debt? Liam Halligan says, we're already in the age of Chinese capital. Go to Africa and Chinese capital is everywhere. Obviously, in the U.S. Treasury, Chinese capital is everywhere. Now buying fewer and fewer U.S. Treasuries, but Halligan assured they can't retreat completely because that would cannibalize the value of their own holdings.
Halligan shared that it pretty much went unreported in Western media, but just 3 weeks ago, China issued rules that allow international investors, who he stated were, quote, relatively sophisticated investors, assess Chinese stock markets both onshore and offshore. Well, the rules make it much easier to invest in Chinese stocks as a result of that. And Halligan added, with increasing determination, China is asserting itself.
As was mentioned earlier, China is planning to build infrastructure not just across its own country, but others as well. Ms. Lee mentioned they actually have plans to have high-speed rail going all over Africa as well as across the Euro-Asian landmass, and even trying to stretch into Latin America. So this is actually very ambitious, she said.
Lee also draws to our remembrance China's yuan taking over the U.S. dollar is a bit exaggerated, stating because we have to remember that the U.S. dollar remained dominant even when the euro came into being. And while the euro did take quite a bit of market share, it still did not dislodge the U.S. dollar.
Lee came to the conclusion that while China is still in the early stages of its capital building, if it would gain more market shares over time, that won't really mean it would push the US dollar out. She thought the only thing that might do that was if, quote, the US military gets eclipsed by another power, which, of course, is very highly unlikely.
That's right. Mr. Halligan reiterated this point when he said, no one is saying that the dollar won't remain important. It absolutely will remain important. However, he added, it can't assume hegemonic status into the future and all the senior age rights and financial advantages that come with that. So, Jeff, if the Chinese aren't buying nearly as much of the U.S. treasuries as they used to, well, won't the United States begin to worry about that?
That's a great question. The U.S. has a mechanism of dealing with this, according to Alistair MacLeod, who says that is to print money or credit. And that basically is what's going to happen. There are no two ways about it, he said.
If we don't have enough,
print some more.
That's right. Wow. If only we could do that. Well, this could result in China turning inward to Asia and surrounding countries. MacLeod said China's got a market of 4 billion people. If you take her own population, India's population, and the whole of Southeast Asia, which I know is in the American sphere of influence. But also we've got Russia.
He says those two countries in particular have a strong relationship due to the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, in which Russia provides resources and China provides manufacturing. MacLeod points out it's a very, very powerful combination, which broadly speaking can survive on its own without America if America goes into a currency meltdown.
And I know a part of that, those resources we reported in the past, was Russia signing a very large natural gas deal with China to supply them with natural gas. So that's a part of that. He believes it's inevitable for that to take place and foresees the Chinese and Russian partnership becoming stronger and focusing on each other rather than outwardly to the rest of the world.
Well, we now turn to our field correspondent, Larry McGee, who has a first ever King of Saudi Arabia visiting Russia. Larry, what can you tell us about this very important meeting?
Competition is heating up between the world's superpowers as Russia deepens its stakes in the Middle East, forging new deals with Saudi Arabia. In an unprecedented move, King Salman visited Russia recently, where he met with President Putin and was expected to discuss Syria and Iran, in addition to signing several commercial deals. In answering the question as to why the two oil titans are developing closer ties and changing the nature of their relationship, analysts say that all of the geopolitical cards are being reshuffled. The two nations have been historic rivals in the past and are said to have only established formal relations following the breakup of the Soviet Union. The thought is that the circumstances in Syria have definitely been a factor, as Moscow is beginning to be seen as more of a major player by the Mideast nations following the perceived victories of Bashar al-Assad, which are largely attributed to Russian intervention. The chief reason for the emerging relationship is said to be a no-brainer for those in the know. Oil is believed to be a huge element in it all, and while the two nations have been in fierce competition in years past for market share, they are said to have begun working in cooperation as early as last December to reduce oil output in an effort to stabilize oil prices. One of the concerns of the Saudis is believed to be whether or not Russia will remain firm in its commitment in that regard and continue to work with the members of OPEC to protect and maintain oil prices at a certain level, despite the fact that Russia itself is not an OPEC member. Though the details are sketchy, arms agreements are also said to be on the table, including talks of Russian ballistic missiles and air defense systems, along with the possibility of military training and assistance establishing infrastructure for a civil nuclear complex. The U.S. is said to be keeping a concerned eye on things, though analysts don't believe that the recent move by Saudi Arabia can necessarily be seen as an intention to sever ties with America and join entirely with Russia. Nonetheless, the two are major players, and so their increased cooperation is definitely raising eyebrows as everyone waits to see what they are going to do. Not knowing what the current U.S. administration is going to do, however, is reportedly one of the reasons why the Saudis are seeking to strengthen and explore ties with other powers. The strain in the relationship between the U.S. and Qatar is also suspected to be a point of concern for the Saudis, who are said to be worried if the future might not hold the same sort of change in U.S. relations for them as well. As a show of different intentions, Saudi leaders have lent their support to the de-escalation zones brokered by Moscow, Turkey, and Iran. For YPN News, I'm Larry McGee. Katan Jeff, back to you.
I guess like with China, we'll see how the relationships with Russia and Saudi Arabia progress towards the future. Well, Alabama's next hopeful U.S. Senator, Judge Roy Moore, who some call a righteous cowboy, ready for the day of reckoning, has been in the news. In a speech to his supporters at a rally, he recently said, "We've got to go back to God. We've got to go back to a moral base." Well, Judge Moore made headlines in the early 2000s when he installed a giant sculpture of the Ten Commandments in the rotunda of the Alabama State Supreme Courthouse. Well, that decision was unpopular with federal courts, as with most moral standards. The case of the Ten Commandments being in that courthouse, that rotunda, went to the Supreme Court, and the judge basically had those commandments removed, and Judge Moore was ultimately fired.
Well, he was later reelected to the state Supreme Court, but then defied the federal courts again on the issue of same-sex marriage, calling it immoral and that it was illegal before the Supreme Court, in the case of Lawrence versus Texas, said that it wasn't. When asked on an interview on C-SPAN, where in the Constitution does Judge Moore find it to outlaw sexual activity which you don't approve of, he responded, "I don't find anything in the Constitution to authorize sodomy in our law."
Powerful words. On the other hand, Moore's opponent, Luther Strange, a former Washington lobbyist, seen by some as a creature from the swamp that President Trump promised to drain. He was in that race against Judge Moore, and of course he lost. Well, in the race for the election, with Luther Strange losing, Moore did win, and Trump's support for his win was made apparent on social media as he began deleting tweets supporting Strange and spun his support for Moore's win. In his victory speech, Moore said that he will support the U.S. President, President Trump, but he said we have to return the knowledge of God and the Constitution to Congress.
Well, regarding tensions with Iran's nuclear deal, the U.S. President Donald Trump said in a recent press conference that this is the calm before the storm. As to what storm, when he was questioned, he said, "You'll find out." In a meeting with his military officials, he said that we must not allow Iran to obtain nuclear weapons because the Iranian regime supports terrorism and exports violence, bloodshed, and chaos across the Middle East.
Wow. He continued saying that that is why we must put an end to Iran's nuclear ambitions, and they have not lived up to the agreement, according to President Trump. But according to the IAEA, Iran has shipped over 12 tons of enriched uranium to Russia, along with mothballing thousands of centrifuges. The IAEA says they have been fulfilling their end of the agreement, and even U.S. Defense Secretary John Mattis said that the U.S. won't pull out of the deal with Iran if it continues to meet their terms of the agreement.
There's a consensus among many in the U.S. administration and the international community that the nuclear deal with Iran is a non-proliferation. Plus, if it's scrapped, then Iran will resume its nuclear activity, which will take us back to square one with an unnecessary crisis of choice.
Yes, all that work for nothing. Well, in Bangladesh, refugees are suffering at the hands of their oppressors, mothers having to treat their burnt infants with nothing more than the breath of their mouths to try to keep them cool because there's no doctors for treatment and no medicine available to deal with the many injured adults and children who have been forced out of their homes when Myanmar's military set their villages ablaze. It's taken survivors 10 days to reach Bangladesh, and those with wounds, including infants and children, are only getting worse as the hot days drag on.
In the Tangali camp for Rouhani refugees, the misery is endless as seen in the faces of the residents, along with the horrid conditions that they're trying to survive in. Now, the situation is so dire that the encampment of 20,000 refugees didn't even exist 3 weeks ago. They are just a few of the more than 500,000 refugees that have crossed into Bangladesh since late August. Now, the UN calls this the most urgent refugee crisis in the world.
Wow. Many of those who've crossed and entered the camps begin the difficult task of trying to find relatives who have also crossed the border. One woman said that we would have stayed in our own homes if only they wouldn't have been shooting at us and set fire to our homes. We had to hide in the jungle eating leaves, and of course they set fire to their homes, and she said we couldn't stay there anymore. They had nothing to go back to.
And lastly, the refugees across the world have some positive aspects to it. For Syrian refugees at the Zatari refugee camp in Jordan, there's some light in their dark tunnel: work. One Syrian refugee, Khaldun Harari, landed a job at a poultry processing plant. He said now he has a routine. Every morning he goes to work and returns in the evening. Before this, my life was meaningless, he said. Now, the job center in the camp was able to place him and many others in employment and hope to open up work opportunities for thousands more people.
I could imagine how great that feels to have some purpose, to be able to do something for yourself, to provide something for your family as well. Well, they hope to help many living in what's the world's largest Syrian refugee camp with an estimated 80,000 people. Stefanos Ver, a UNHCR representative, said the significance here is not only work, but for refugees who go and register for work permits, they're also being entitled to legally go outside the camp. So far, there have been 800 since this work center has been set up, 800 refugees who have signed up for work, according to the International Labor Organization.
Well, with this opportunity available, refugees said that they feel hope now, as depending on aid is not enough to support their families. Now they can work to keep busy, and there are plans to open another refugee camp in Jordan to try to give people who have already lost so much through war something back.
That's nice. Well, for those who are looking for a true light at the end of this tunnel and, of course, this darkened world by mankind's activities, well, you can find it and so much more at the House of Yahweh, where everyone is welcome who wants to live by and receive the benefits of the laws of peace. You can contact the House of Yahweh today to find your lifeline in these turbulent waters. And when you do, don't forget to request your free copies of the monthly newsletter and, of course, the Prophetic Word magazine. Here's how.
To contact the House of Yahweh, you can write them at the House of Yahweh, P.O. Box 2498, Abilene, Texas 79604. You can call them at 1-800-613-9494. Visit them on any of their websites: www.yahweh.com, www.yisraelhawkins.com, or www.yahwehsbranch.com. You can also visit our website at www.ypnnews.com. For any emails, you can email at info@yahweh.com. Any international calls, you can call the number that's on your screen now. And lastly, we'd like to remind you of two excellent Bible study helps on the market today, absolutely free: the Yisrael Says program and the Ask Yisrael program. You can learn more about them by going to www.yisraelsays.com and www.askyisrael.com.
Well, up next, the one bringing hope to a dying world, Yisrael Hawkins. From all of us here at YPN News, I'm Katan Alexander.
And I'm Jeffrey Heimerman.
Thank you for watching.